Welcome back to the European Dialogue, a podcast brought to you by the Jean Monnet EU Values Network. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by someone whose work sits right at the intersection of regionalism, political development, and Southeast Asian studies. Sukmawani Bela Pertiwi. Bela is currently the coordinator for EU studies at the Centre for Business and Diplomatic Studies, CBDS, in Jakarta. She previously lectured in the International Relations Department at Universitas Gadjah Mada, or UGM, one of Indonesia's leading academic institutions. Bela's academic journey also began at UGM, where she completed her bachelor's degree in international relations in 2010, before earning a master's degree in international politics from American University in Washington, D.C. Over the years, she has held several roles across research and academia, including serving as Manager of Publications at the Institute of International Studies and spending 5 years as a researcher at UGM's Centre for South Asian Social Studies, contributing to a deeper understanding of the region through her scholarship and engagement. I had the pleasure of meeting Bela earlier this year in Istanbul at an EU Values Conference on democracy and human rights, and it felt like the perfect moment to bring her onto the podcast to explore some of these themes in more depth. In this episode, we'll be talking about ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, its origins, and how the organisation has evolved far beyond economic cooperation. We'll discuss ASEAN's role in democracy and human rights, explore the current state of EU-ASEAN relations, and unpack the challenges that arise when a self-styled normative power, like the European Union, engages with the region where sovereignty is strongly protected. Most importantly, we'll look at how both regions interact on human rights issues, from policy dialogues to softer, hybrid forms of engagement, and what tools the EU actually has at its disposal to influence change. So stay tuned and be sure to check out the podcast description for all links and information in this episode. So welcome to the podcast, Bela. Great to meet with you today.
Nice to meet you too.
To start us off, could you walk us through the historical origins of ASEAN, how it was established, what it represents today, its key characteristics, and why has it become such an important actor in relation to democracy and human rights?
Okay, so ASEAN was established in 1967, and I would say that there was a unique context, historical context, that makes then the institutional design of ASEAN was different from the European Union. First of all, the ASEAN was established in 1967 when all of its members, the founding fathers of ASEAN, they were newly independent states, and so they need to focus on, first of all, economic development, because they need to catch up with other countries, and they need basically to deal with economic reconstruction after the war. And so that's why they need regional cooperation and regional stability. And then second, their other concern of the states is domestic politics. These newly independent states, many of them were in the phase of nation building and state building. And so that's why they need to have regional stability for them to be able to focus at the domestic level. But then the problem is that at the same time, they also are very cautious in having regional cooperation, more because they just gained their independence. And even after they gained their independence, there were efforts from Western colonial powers to return or at least to stay in the region. And then there were also territorial dispute among Southeast Asian countries. So basically, there were mutual suspicion among them. So they need regional cooperation on the one hand, but then they were very cautious to have this regional organization. And so, they eventually agreed to establish ASEAN in 1967. But this new regional organization have to be minimalist in the sense that they uphold sovereignty and non-interference principle. But then why I began with this explanation, because it then made ASEAN become an elitist organization, very top-down, and then many people in Southeast Asia do not really know what ASEAN do actually. And so with all the development in the 1990s, then ASEAN think to reform the organization, not to be we call it as elitist, to become more people-centered organization that deal not only with the high political issues, not only with economic issues, but also with social issues as well, because it's apparent that since in the 1990s even 2000s, the interaction, mobility, and then economic transaction among Southeast Asian countries, they were remain limited. Internal trade within ASEAN was only less than 25% compared to their external trade. So that's why, to boost this internal mobility, interaction, then ASEAN have to switch to deepen the integration, and so that's why the idea of ASEAN community. But what is interesting about ASEAN community is that it gives the social aspect of regional organization. It is more people-centered, and it also broadened the norm, which was previously focused on sovereignty and non-interference. Now they also take into account democracy and human rights. In Bangkok Declaration, that's the document establishing ASEAN. It was started with we Southeast Asian nations, but then the new so-called, perhaps the ASEAN Charter, start with we the people of ASEAN.
Interesting, thank you. Yeah, that's a great overview of how a regional organization has branched out beyond just economy and trade, to include social issues too, as you say. I hope some of these values are also shared in the EU model, which brings me on nicely to the next question. In your assessment, what are the current state of relations between the EU and ASEAN?
Okay. So the EU and ASEAN, they were said to be two of the most leading or most advanced regional organizations in the world, but the relations between these two organizations were quite distant because, okay, on the one hand, we see that there have been significant development in the relations between the two. EU has been working with ASEAN since the 1970s, right? And was among the first country to establish informal relations with ASEAN, and then the cooperation continues until 2020, in which two regional organizations agreed to establish strategic partnership. But then, why I say that the relations quite distant? First of all, if we look at people's perception about the EU, there was a survey conducted in 2012. I still remember that, and the survey found that many Southeast Asian people see the role of the EU is not as important as China and the US. So they still look up to these two great powers, and then after that, what is interesting is that we often talk about EU has been closely identified as normative power, but in Southeast Asia, the EU has been more identified as economic power or trade power. But what is more interesting is that people's perceptions see EU as a demanding trade power, and that may have more disadvantage to the region. That's the result of the survey at that time. So that's what I say, there is a gap between what have been agreed on paper and the people's perception in the region. And then there are also developments between the two organizations which make the relation between EU and ASEAN quite distant. We may reflect, for example, in regard to the rise of China, which make then the EU's Asia policy tend to focus more on China. In regards to trade liberalization and democratization as well, EU has become one of the major economic power, but then ASEAN, as I mentioned earlier, internal trade among Southeast Asian countries are still limited, right? So it expand or broaden the gap between the EU and ASEAN. This has not mentioned the values between the two countries. EU always adopt its norm, including democracy, in its relation to other countries. Meanwhile, many Southeast Asian some Southeast Asian countries, if not many Southeast Asian countries, were not fully democratic countries, and issues such as democracy in Myanmar, for example, and in the past, perhaps the issues of Timor-Leste in Indonesia have been one of the problems in the relation between these two. And lastly, perhaps EU's reliance on a US security umbrella also makes EU not an option for security guarantor in Southeast Asia.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that breakdown. It's very interesting to hear that despite some of the pretty long-standing relations, that the nature and the perception of that relationship has changed and how it's changed over time.
Right.
The EU loves to pride itself on being a strong normative power, so it's very interesting to hear that for ASEAN, at least, the EU primarily is just a trade partner. Well, not just a trade partner, but it's certainly
Yeah.
not a security partner or really a very important actor for the region anymore. Yeah, very interesting to hear that. Exploring a little further, what you mentioned there about how in recent years values have felt misaligned between some countries in the Southeast Asian region and the EU. In what way have these regions engaged in democracy and human rights?
So first of all, as a context, the EU-ASEAN relations is a bit unique and challenging because it is a type of interregional cooperation or interregionalism, which is usually more challenging because they have more limited interaction, transaction, and shared culture between them. So there are more risks for for misunderstanding, loss in translation, and there is no direct incentives in this relation. Like for example, the EU, if the EU would like to diffuse the norms of human right to neighboring countries, they could over incentive to become members of the EU, but in regards to ASEAN, that was not the case, right? And so, what has EU done, or to what extent EU engaged with ASEAN in regards to human right norms? So, there are three types of regional interaction. The first one is bi-regional interaction directly between the EU and ASEAN, and in this regard, EU and ASEAN has the so-called EU-ASEAN policy dialogue on human rights, which have started several years and still continues up to present. That become one of the umbrella for the dialogue between these two organizations regard to human rights. That's the main avenue. But then we have to also take into account other types of interregional interaction that is the so-called transregionalism. This is the interaction between the EU and ASEAN together with other actors, with other countries or regional organizations in a broader fora. So, for example, of course, the UN is one example where interaction in the General Assembly could also become an avenue for the EU to socialize its concern over human rights issues in Southeast Asia and vice versa. And then the third one is what many authors called as hybrid regionalism. That is the relation between the EU with ASEAN member states directly. So these are, I would say, what I think more dominant interaction, how the EU diffuse human rights norms in Southeast Asia. At the ASEAN level, even though I said that ASEAN have become ASEAN community, but the norms of sovereignty and non-interference still there. As it was because of this norm that ASEAN eventually could emerge, that all countries in Southeast Asia, the founding fathers could agree they cooperate in ASEAN, right? But then because of this, then it makes it difficult to have sensitive conversation at the regional organizations level, particularly regarding to human rights issues, which perhaps countries think that it should be within their sovereignty.
Right, yes, totally. It sounds like a big issue of leverage there.
Right.
Like the EU is positioning itself with its norms and its values, but yet its ability to influence its partners, especially in a region where sovereignty is deeply valued, seems to be quite limited in that sense. So then, for example, on issues like the continued use of the death penalty in parts of Southeast Asia, something which is firmly opposed within the EU, what legal or political tools does the EU actually use to encourage change?
So there are perhaps, I would say, two strategies. The first one is that the EU approach Southeast Asia more from the bottom up, in the way that, okay, it's more difficult to get into Southeast Asia to promote this norm through regional organizations, And so bottom up, engaging more with civil societies, non-state actors in the region could become an option. And so far, the EU, for example, have worked with the World Coalition Against Death Penalty. And then they regularly celebrate the World Day on the Abolition of Death Penalty, which actually was important to raise awareness on the importance of abolishing death penalty in the region. And then the second strategy, I would say, that remember the three types of interregional interaction, right? The bi-regionalism, and then trans-regionalism, and then hybrid interregionalism. And so I see that the EU tend to rely the last one, the hybrid interregionalism, meaning they directly approach the individual ASEAN countries to promote the abolition of death penalty. And the way they do that, first, the way they deal with this differing legal and political approach to death penalty, they have different approach to abolitionist countries and to retentionist countries. So abolitionist countries refers to countries that have abolished death penalty, both in practice or in its legal system. Meanwhile, retentionist countries are those countries that still retain death penalty in their legal system, and in practice as well. And so what I observe is that the EU have approached these two categories differently. For the abolitionist country, the EU provide assistance to make sure that these countries maintain their abolition position and move forward to become abolitionists. But for countries who are retentionists, then the EU, for example, often made, every time there were executions in Southeast Asian countries, for example, Singapore was quite active in executions, the EU always provide local statement asking to call to stop this execution. And then there's also another method that is particularly to retentionist countries who still adopt death penalty. That is embedding human rights dialogue to partnership and cooperation agreement or FTA negotiation. So the EU are currently negotiating FTAs or comprehensive partnership, right? And then PCA to Southeast Asian countries, and then they embed this human rights dialogue as part of it. And in this dialogue, they talk about the death penalty.
So it sounds like there are maybe some softer ways that the EU advocates for stronger human rights, including through hybrid regionalism, which you touched on a bit today, depending on the country's status.
Yeah.
So given ASEAN's cultural and political diversity, where do you think Europe has the greatest chance of effectively supporting democracy and human rights in the region?
Yeah, in the literature, they identify that there are two methods of norm socialization. The first one is strategic adoption, meaning that countries, they adopt certain norm without thinking the validity of that norm, but more for a pragmatic reason, and usually happen in the beginning of this norm socialization. Okay, because we don't want to get punished or to be ashamed that we violate international norm, then we're going to show that we take that norm. That's one thing. And then second is through moral consciousness raising, or through dialogue, basically persuasion, which I think is more sustainable. But what is interesting is that this literature argues that the second in this second case, countries, they adopt certain norm from other countries because they also agree on the truth, on the validity, on the moral rightness of this norm, right? But then this is more sustainable, long term. But it could only happen if the norm promoter, they socialize this norm and treat the norm taker equally. They engage them in dialogue. Yeah, so community, what I would like to say, communicative action matters. Yeah. So what I would like to say is that that's also the case in the European Union's engagement with Southeast Asia, meaning they have to always take into account communicative actions because we have different ways, right, in communication between Europe and Southeast Asia. But what I often see from what youth representatives in Southeast Asia, for example, they can rely on simply putting information in the websites or providing links and expect those in Southeast Asia to read the information and understand what it is, right? So communicative engagement, dialogue, I think it's important.
Absolutely. What you described there, the slower but yes, more sustainable way of changing the hearts and minds through advocacy seems like the best approach. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Bella, for your time today and your expertise. It was wonderful to learn from you.
Okay, thank you for listening.
And listeners, tell us what you think. You can find all the information mentioned in today's episode in the podcast description, and we want to hear from you. So leave us a comment. You can find us on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and across our social media as well. We would really value your feedback. Thank you very much for listening.